So we look for our kids to have a character, a heart of obedience, a character of respect that causes them to make wise decisions.
Don't be afraid of the dark. Be careful with stars. Not every light is gonna guide you, baby. Not every light is gonna guide you.
So, Dr. Kathy, today on the Celebrate Kids podcast, in this daily segment, Facing the Dark, I want to talk a little bit about something that I think is kind of interesting related to how we parent kids, especially teenagers. One of the most important and often misunderstood realities about parenting teenagers is that rules of connection actually change as their brains develop. Now, research shows that adolescence, really starting as early as 10, is a period of rapid emotional and social rewiring for kids, where kids actually begin turning more towards their peers and pushing for independence than they did before. But here's the key in some of these findings, Dr. Kathy, even as they pull away, the quality of the parent-child relationships really does remain one of the strongest protective factors for their mental health in what we're seeing inside of the research. Studies consistently show that staying connected during these pre-adolescent, kind of adolescent years isn't about controlling more. It's actually about shifting how we show up. So techniques like emotional coaching or active listening or non-judgmental responses aren't just kind of nice parenting ideas. They're actually evidence-based strategies that improve mental regulation and emotional regulation. They reduce risky behavior and keep communication open with kids. In other words, as our kids grow into their teenage years, their growth for independence doesn't shrink our parental responsibility. It actually should mature our parental engagement. And the parents who adjust how they engage their kids, who stay relationally close when it matters most, are the ones that help their kids the most with their mental health as they continue to mature. Now, Dr. Kathy, I say all of that with kind of this caveat, and it's a caveat that I've experienced as a parent, that oftentimes my kids grow and develop and mature at different ages and even in different stages. And it's something that I was kind of turned on to be okay with when you have taught me about this idea of chronological age versus character age. I think there's a shift that needs to happen with our parenting where we really move from maturing and seeing our kids kind of grow to be 13 years old. And now because they're 13, they can do these things, to really saying, are they mature enough to handle these things? Not just that they turned 16, they should get a driver's license, but are they mature enough to handle this? Do they have the character age to be at this place and not just the chronological age to have those things? I never thought about it though, Dr. Kathy, in terms of how we relate to our kids or even like look at them as they're developing, the kinds of conversations that we have. And you're famous for saying this in the podcast that it quote unquote, always depends on, the situation or where your kids are at. And you never want to kind of pinpoint it to an age, but I'm starting to be maybe like an advocate for that. So I want to kind of jump into this and ask you, what are some of the markers of character age that we might think of as really chronological age for when maybe we should look at our kids differently, that they're no longer, the cute pajama wearing 7-year-old, and they're actually maybe that mature 10-year-old who's ready to take on some responsibilities. How do we know when our kids are kind of reaching that stage where we would say their character age is ahead of maybe what we would kind of quote unquote look at as their chronological age?
Yeah, I'm glad we're talking about it. And it is tricky. I'm glad you're recognizing that and acknowledging that. What I think must be really tricky at times would be to have a 7-year-old who's got a higher character age than a 9-year-old. That would be challenging because that would mean that you would honor the character age and you would give the 7-year-old more freedom than you would give the 9-year-old. And then the 9-year-old would complain, well, why does Billy get to do it? And then you would say, well, Billy has shown us that he's capable of independently figuring out how the world works or whatever you would say. So it's an interesting idea. And I came up with this idea in a couple of ways just to make sure our audience understands. As a quick example, a 16-year-old is allowed to drive, assuming that, they've taken a test and they have a learner's permit, then they get to drive with an adult in the passenger seat. But you know what? If my 16-year-old is arrogant and impulsive and entitled and not teachable, he's not driving. It doesn't matter if he's 16 and he legally can, he doesn't get to because his choices indicate that he's not ready. A 13-year-old is legally allowed on some social media platforms, but again, if she is already entitled, already comparing, already jealous, already prideful, she's not getting on, social media in my house, even though she legally can. This is a character issue. And as I wrote in my book, Parent Differently, character age shows up with complete character. How many character qualities can your children use? The second thing that I would look at is consistently. Our children, as an example, are children patient with people who can give them something or patient with everyone? Are they kind only to those who they know, or are they kind to everyone? And then the third quality that I look for in a mature character age would be automatic. Can they automatically be patient, or do you have to remind them every time you stop by to visit grandma to be patient because grandma walks slowly? So we look for our kids to have a character, a heart of obedience, a character of respect that causes them to make wise decisions and live, in an other-centered kind of world. I think being other-centered and not self-centered is evidence that's strong because technology causes us to be self-centered. So if somebody is other-centered, that would be something that you would want to acknowledge and be grateful for and celebrate as a sign, again, of maturity.
How would you say then, with all of that, that our parenting should adapt or change, maybe even kind of this idea of like evolving as our kids mature? What would you kind of expect in some of that?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I think we always lead our kids and prayerfully they follow. I think when they're younger, we walk ahead. And as they mature and they are open to conversational teaching, not just being taught by example, but being taught also by word, then I think we walk with them. So we walk in the front and they follow our example. They walk in our footsteps. They mimic us. Then we walk side by side and they become like us as they see how we handle things. And then what if I suggest that they lead out and we follow? And we find out if they're leading well by our attempts to follow them and, if you will, not get into trouble in those situations. The other thing that comes to mind, Wayne, and this has got to be challenging, but is to begin to release decision making to them. If we always make decisions for them of where will they go and where they will sit and how much they will eat and when they go to bed and when they do their homework and if they should, FaceTime their aunt, if we make every decision for them, then they will have a very hard time of being mature and making wise, biblically mature decisions when we're not there to tell them what to do. So at some point, with a 7-year-old, with a 9-year-old, you begin to say, what do you think is best? You've seen what I've done. You've seen your older sister. What do you think would be best right now? And then you congratulate them for wisdom and you correct them if they're being foolish. And you continue to guide them as long as you need to. Yeah. Challenging. So important.
Yeah, Dr. Kathy, I want to, kind of jump a little bit deeper into this because there is this phrase of kind of like growing older. And it's almost like an inevitability dynamic in parenting that we think that our kids are going to grow older. And so as they grow older, it's just natural that they kind of like continue to grow older. But
Mhm.
but sometimes they don't necessarily mature, right?
You're right.
And so they get to this place where we're parenting kids who aren't maturing, but they're just getting older and older and older. And I'll just, kind of put this out there that some kids are actually very slow at maturing, or they mature at different stages or ages, maybe I should say. And
Mhm.
so there can be almost like this, I don't know, they're maturing differently. Is that like kind of a bad? What should we do when our kids do mature or form character, maybe at a slower rate than other kids or other friends, or even like some of their peers, or even what we kind of would look at from a standpoint of society? How should we parent kids that mature slower?
Well, I think we need to support them and protect them. If they are maturing slower, then we don't let them out on their own, even though a younger sibling might be out on their own. we make sure that the babysitter understands that this is the daughter who has a tendency to be impulsive and not think things through. We don't do those things to be judgmental and harsh, but we have a responsibility to protect, and we don't put them out until they're ready to be put out, if you will. So we continually train them. We don't judge ourselves or our kids as being bad or stupid. We maybe recognize that they're deceived or they're confused, and maybe they don't discern clarity as well as a sibling might. And I would really encourage our audience to understand the benefit of being people smart. So the 8 smarts that we talk about so often here at the ministry, when we're being people smart, we can read and respond well to body language, and we can understand what the crowd is doing. We understand the motive behind the conversation, et cetera. So if you have a child who's not maturing well, it might be that she is not able to discern what's going on. She doesn't understand why somebody said what he said or why somebody did what she did. So maybe you have to talk that out loud and you say, hey, did you notice how Lisa handled that struggle? And she stepped back and walked away rather than stepping in and engaging. She chose that there was no benefit of her speaking up. And why do you think she made that decision? So I think we make sure that our kids who can't automatically see it are helped to understand it by our observational strength.
As Dr. Kathy and I were talking today, it reminded me of a passage that comes from Hebrews chapter 5, and I'll read verse 12 to 14. In fact, though, by this time you ought to be teachers. You need someone to teach you the elementary truths of God's word over again. You need milk, not solid food. Anyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is not acquainted with the teachings about righteousness. But solid food is for mature people who, by constant use, have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. The writer of Hebrews challenges believers who, by time, should be more mature, but by development really aren't. He says, by this time, you ought to be teachers. And then he says that they still need spiritual milk, not solid food. Paul echoes this idea later on when he writes, when I was a child, I spoke like a child. When I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. Now, in the early church, maturity was not assumed by age. It was actually measured by discernment and self-control and the ability to actually go out and live out truth. Spiritual leaders understood that growth was uneven sometimes. Some advanced quickly, but others actually needed more time and guidance. God relates to us based on our readiness, not just our stage of life. We see that time and again in how God called different people at different stages and ages to be people who led his people in important times. Maturity is about character, not chronology. This is where wisdom is revealed. Two kids can be the same age, but vastly different in responsibility and emotional regulation, even in decision making. And so if we parent only by age, we may give too much freedom too soon or hold on too tightly for too long. So it's important for us as parents to, like Dr. Kathy said, look for some markers of maturity, things like ownership, humility, follow-through, teachability. And then we can adjust freedom based on what's demonstrated by their character, not just by their birthdays. In all of this, it's important for us as parents to have open conversations, to say things like, here's what maturity looks like. Here's what I'm kind of seeing. To help our kids understand that we're actually looking for maturity, not just age, as they're growing up and getting to a place where they're looking towards adulthood and maybe more freedoms. You're not just raising older kids when our kids get older. We're actually raising people that are stepping into maturity in manhood and womanhood and to have characteristics like that. I think helping our kids and being clear in some of this can be important for them, especially as they're working to develop and grow and mature and to take on more responsibilities and freedoms. And it can be a bright light that shines and cuts through some of the darkness or uncertainty that they're facing. I hope that's an encouragement for you, and I hope this whole podcast and all that we do here at Celebrate Kids is an encouragement for you. I'm so glad you joined us today on the Celebrate Kids podcast, this daily segment, Facing the Dark. On behalf of Dr. Kathy Cook, my name is Wayne Stender. So glad you joined us today, and we're looking forward to seeing you here again tomorrow.